So welcome everyone today to the Bendigo Tech School's Tech Future Talk. Today we'll be looking at the future of food, bees, technology and innovation. We're very lucky today to welcome three guests, one from CSIRO, two from Hivekeepers, as well as Cto. So if Simon, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everybody, my name's Simon Mildren and I am the CEO of Hivekeepers. A little bit of background about me. A number of years ago I completed a degree in applied science, environmental management, spent some time in that space in land management, park ranger service and the like, moved from there into the fire service and then into the actual fire brigade. So I've been involved in the leadership space in the fire brigade for a number of years. And one thing led to another, and with some time on my hands and some acreage, I ended up having bees. And there's more of a story to that, but maybe that's for another day. But having had bees now for the last 10 years, it's made me passionate and excited about bees. And it's also strangely got me interested in technology and how we can do more to support and be involved with looking after such an important species. Something that I never thought back at the beginning was going to be an important part of my life. But that's where I am now. And at Hivekeepers, we are looking at creating smarter beekeepers and healthier hives for a sustainable future. So that's probably a good starting point. Thanks. Great to be here.
That's great, Simon. And now I just want to introduce you to Slade.
Hi, so I'm Slade Beard. I am the CTO of Hivekeepers, working alongside Simon in developing some of that technology around beekeeping. I'm also the CEO of Cto and own and manage what's known as Cto Farm. Cto Farm is a platform developed to develop new generation technologies for the management of farming and environmental considerations in the landscape. I've been in the information technology industry for nigh on 33 years. That's why I have hardly any hair left. And I've loved the journey and having fun with the Hivekeepers work now.
Marendy. I'm the team leader for the microsystems team.
That's wonderful, Slade. And I would also like to introduce you to Peter Marendy.
And the cybernetics research group is part of the cyber physical systems research program within Data 61. So our program is about combining technology with the physical world. So my background is quite diverse. I've done lots of things, but essentially I'm a computer scientist and a computer systems engineer. And I've been working with the bees now for about 5 years with a project to put tags on bees so that we can look at their activity and produce models of bee behavior to help identify ways to predict hive health and therefore prevent pollination, pollinator loss. So, of which bees are one pollinator.
Well, welcome everyone to our Tech Futures Talk. We're going to jump straight into some questions. So our first question for you all today is, why are we here to talk about bees?
Wow, that's it's a big question and it's a really important one for people to be aware of. And we've already heard a little bit from Peter about how there's been a decline of bees over the last 50 or so years and how research has been looking at ways that we can be able to secure bee populations into the future. And I agree with all of that, and that's really critical research and work that's being done to try to solve the global problem surrounding the decline in honeybees. But really, why are we doing that is what could be asked. And the reason is actually quite simple. It's because the food that lands on our plate, the food that we enjoy, that provides us the nutrition and the like to make us grow and make our children grow, deeply rely on honeybees and the effect that they have on pollination to make sure that we have the food system that we need. There's 4 key pillars to food security, and food security is something that anyone listening to this should be aware about and ensuring, and probably takes advantage of the fact that we have a relatively good, secure food supply system, especially here in Australia. But if we've ever felt vulnerable, it's been now during this coronavirus period of time where we've noticed that there has been a stretched system, that there's been supply chain issues, and that food security is probably not something that has concerned us a whole lot, but it should be in your mind now. Those 4 pillars to food security are availability. So that's ensuring we've got a reliable food supply of sufficient quantity and quality. The second one is access, ensuring that we've got adequate resources to be able to obtain that appropriate food. The third one is utilisation, and that is so that we can actually have the nutrition requirements for ourselves and our growing bodies of our small humans, and stability, and that is making sure that it's permanent and durable access to food at all times. And so availability, access, utilisation, and stability, they just might seem like fancy words, but realistically, the value that sits in behind that idea is critical to each and every one of us. And if it's not something that's come across your plate until we've just discussed this now, chances are you've taken advantage of the system. And that's okay to be like that, but let's try to think about how we can be part of improving food security globally. And I can tell you now at Hivekeepers, that's something we're particularly interested in, is being able to find ways where we can encourage people into beekeeping, especially in developing agricultural-based countries. We're going to encourage people into beekeeping to create diversity and more opportunity for them on their farm, and also helping them secure their own local food supplies. There's some really critical factors about like why we should be here talking about bees today, and where I see relevance in this discussion.
Hey, Simon, I love some of the points you made there. It's interesting for me because listening to what Peter has to say, listening to what you have to say, and then I come from this from a different point of view, and it's probably it's compatible with, but it's very much focused on that availability question. My heritage is I'm a 6th generation farming family in South Australia. My family came out in the first settlers of South Australia, and they established market gardens and farms across South Australia over the last 5 generations before me. I grew up living in the middle of my grandfather's market gardens in now what is a suburban area of Adelaide. What's interesting about that is 2 things. Number one, the area that he had the market gardens in and which had provided food for Adelaide for several generations is now completely under housing. So we've lost food production area, and it was critical food production on the banks of the Torrens River and therefore deep soil. And the other consideration in that is that we now have an urban environment in which bees still have to play a part. And I think that the COVID situation has actually done a regeneration, or created a regeneration of the desire in people to have the same skills that our grandparents had, i.e. to know how to have a vegetable garden, to grow their own vegetables. And for that to work, the urban landscape has to incorporate bees. So why are we here to talk about bees? They are an integral part of that food availability system. And for me, coming from my background, I think that availability question is something that I'm very heavily focused on.
So globally, pollination, or pollinators in this case, bees have been declining for about 50 years. So the populations have been declining steadily until about 15 years ago, and at which time there was a crash in bee populations through the Northern Hemisphere. And at that point, people started to look more closely at bees. And so about 80% of agriculture is pollinated by insects, and that includes bees, right? Of which about 1/3 of those crops are pollinated almost exclusively by bees. And so when you take into account the effects of bee pollination and the sort of crops they're pollinating and the on-flow effects, about 1/3 of the food that we eat is as a direct result of pollination by bees. And so if we've got a declining population of bees for reasons unknown, and that means that we've got a declining capacity to grow food. And so when we look at, for example, the World Health Organization, they're predicting that by 2050, the population of the world will require 70% more food than it did just 10 years ago. So you have a decline in pollinators and a rise in need for food. And so it means that there's, at some point, we won't be able to grow enough food to feed the population if we don't address issues with the decline in populations of pollinators, including bees. So this is actually a real problem, you know. And so in developed nations like Australia, that decline in the ability to grow crops will be manifested by a reduced range and volume of fruits, nuts, seeds, and vegetables, which will see some nutritional deficiencies in the community and increased prices for some of those products. Whereas in developing nations, this is potentially famine, economic collapse, food refugees, and conflict. And so this is a real problem because it's a global problem. So it's a problem we need to solve.
So you all touched on how important bees are and how they're vital to the future of food. So the big question is now is what's leading innovation in this space?
Simon?
Yeah, wow. You would be surprised at what is occurring in this space with regard to trying to apply technology and innovation to help solve some of these problems. And to give you an example of a few, we've had, and Hivekeepers is involved in some of these, but in terms of sensor enabling a beehive, so smart beehives, and I'm not sure what that conjures up in your mind initially, but the idea of being able to put micro sensors inside beehives can tell us a story about what's happening, and what may happen in the future with our bees. So some of the sensors there, people love to know a bit more about that. So if we know that there's temperature and humidity, that can tell us a lot about the internal conditions. Another one which surprises people, but is acoustics. So we like to be able to hear what's going on inside the beehive. If we can hear what's going on, we can use artificial intelligence, machine learning to be able to predict and understand what is happening now and what will happen in the short term. And for those beekeepers that are here, if we could tell you a couple of days in advance that your bees were about to swarm and leave, you'd be pretty appreciative of that knowledge to know that that's a problem that's about to occur. Second to that, we also can weigh a hive, and we can tell the beekeeper 24/7 the weight and those other factors we've already talked about, so they can have a really close understanding of what's happening with their bees, even when they're a long way away from them. So if you're a commercial beekeeper, chances are here in Australia, you might be at times hundreds of kilometres away from your bees. And right now there's bees sitting in the almonds of northwest Victoria and southern or southwest New South Wales. And the beekeepers may or may not be near them, but if they could sense what's going on with their bees without having to be there, they can have a better understanding about the health. So if you're a honey production beekeeper and you're waiting to make a decision about when to go and visit your beehives 500-600 kilometres away, wouldn't it be good to know the weight of that beehive before you head off? Because you might arrive, without knowing that, you might arrive and find out that you're 3 or 4 days ahead of yourself, or maybe you're a bit late and you could have harvested a few days ago and you could have already had more value out of those bees being located somewhere where there's a really good nectar flow. So that's something that's a really common way of trying to solve that problem at the moment. But there are radars that detect where bees are in the landscape to help understand about pollination and the effects of pollination. There are thermal imaging devices which can look at the heat of a beehive and determine the health and well-being on the inside of the hive at that particular point in time from that there. There are other emerging technologies using image recognition, and there's some technology there that Hivekeepers is proud to be involved with, some image recognition technology where we can have a camera set up there and we can detect problems or issues visually that would be hard for us to notice as a person being there, but also we can't be there with our bees all the time. So it's exciting to think that we can have an extra set of eyes and sensors on the beehive so that the beekeeper can be concentrating on either more hives or having more efficiency around their operations, with the fallback that the whole reason they want to do that is because they care deeply for their bees and want the best health outcomes for their bees. I've never met a beekeeper who doesn't care deeply about the health and well-being of their bees. So if we can help them in any way to understand that, then that's absolutely critical as far as I see it.
That's a great segue, Simon, for one of the things that's foremost in my mind in what we're doing. You've outlined lots of data sources that are available and that are being developed as mechanisms to guide the management of the hives. My view as a technologist is beyond the questions that we currently know to the questions that we haven't yet asked. And my view is that as we get the data from the hives, we begin to articulate additional questions that could be asked and answered on the use of the data that we're actually getting in that journey. So I think that data itself is going to be a major innovation leader. And yes, we're talking about machine learning and artificial intelligence, and we know that across so many industries, those things are driving innovation and driving new questions to be asked. And I think that's going to be one of the great things over the next few years as we start to see massive amounts of data starting to come out of hive systems.
What I can't help but mention here, and obviously Slade and I have a fascination around the honeybee and what we can learn in that particular use case, but let's just think for a second about innovation in this food security space, because I get excited about what's happening there, because I think there's more actually happening there in the bigger picture, and the honeybee pollination space is a subset of the food security space. So without going too far down the path on any one of these, but just some things to think about here is we're going to see solutions in the future which shorten the supply chain from the farmer to the consumer. So rather than buying cherries from California and consuming them here in winter, I think here in Melbourne, I think we would see that differently in the future. So supply chains growing closer to the consumer, so the consumer themselves can say, I'm buying delicious apples from the Harcourt Valley, of which I am a member of, that I live in the Harcourt Valley. I think we're going to see interesting challenges in food, where we're going to start to see vertical farming in controlled environment agriculture in and around cities. Slade was right earlier, when we've had some of our most arable and productive and fertile lands bitumenized and concreted and with houses put on them, we've missed some of the best opportunities to have our food supplies close to our cities. But technology is going to change that. We're going to have vertical farming, whereby you essentially have buildings with controlled environment agriculture with huge outputs, better outputs than we could ever imagine, using 90% more or less water, 90% less fertilizer, probably 90% less land, and amazingly almost zero chemicals in those environments. So where we understand and we see how agriculture occurs now, I think we're going to see huge changes in that space, and the precision agriculture, the efficiency gains that we're going to get out of that are really going to be what allows us to feed. I think Peter said there's 10 billion mouths to feed by 2050, well, a statistic like that, Pete, you said. But I don't think that we're actually going to struggle to do all this, because innovation is coming through in a way which is proving already that we've got the right ideas, we've got the right intent. In fact, I was in the Salinas Valley in California back in early March, and we were there listening to an agriculturalist there who said to us, almost pleaded to us, we can already feed the 10 billion mouths that we're going to have in the next 10 or 15 years. The problems that we're seeing is we just have the regulation and the systems around us, and how we get the food to the consumer, and the wastage that goes on. All we need to do is be correcting the system that's around us and looking for those efficiency gains, and the farmer is ready to provide. So look, there's a lot in all of that, but I'm confident that innovation is going to solve this food security space. but we can't wait a moment. We need to be doing that from now. And Hivekeepers is super excited to be working on that, the side of it where it relates to pollination and honeybee health.
One thing I would point out there is that they're in the availability chain and in the access. One of the things that is shaping consumption, particularly in the millennial age group, is traceability of that food supply. So if we can say that we can trace from point of origin to point of destination, and we can tell you where, for example, your honey came from, based on the data that's been collected along that route, then we can actually improve the education of the consumer. That allows us to also take out counterfeit food production mechanisms and so on. And there's a brilliant initiative called the, I think it's the Australian Honey Library, isn't it, Simon?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yep, that is all about understanding what the origin is of a honey. Being able to talk about the pollen and the trees that it came from, and be able to pinpoint exactly the location that the honey came from. Those technologies are going to both inform the consumer, but also allow us to take out those who are creating counterfeit products that taste, for example, like honey, but are actually only having a small proportion of original honey in and being mostly sugar water. We can actually manage all of that and improve food security and improve the quality of the supply through the application of innovation and technology.
And this is a big deal. And it's not just a big deal because we sit here relatively comfortable in Australia and want to know that the honey that we purchase from someone that's produced the honey here in Victoria, for example, gets to us unadulterated and is clean, is pesticide free. That's not a problem exclusive to us here in Australia. And sometimes I think we can think that way. There are 1.4 billion mouths to feed in India, and work that we're already doing in India tells us that there is just as much, if not more, concern with where their food comes from, and that they're getting clean, healthy, reliable, all the 4 pillars I mentioned earlier. This is a problem for all 8 billion of us on the planet. And we're all thinking about it. We all want to be able to feed our children nutritious, healthy, reliable food supplies. And it's exciting that we can actually be having a go at doing something here. A few other, like I wanted to value add on the end of this question, because I think this question of what's leading innovation can go forever. But something that I think, given we've got quite a few students listening to this one, where I would plant some seeds. And I was doing a little bit of research on the internet the other day about like foods of the future, and you could look and find a lot of this yourself. But thinking around what like foods we expect to be eating. And I reckon if you're a student now looking at technology and innovation, how could you get yourself involved in some of these ideas? So firstly, insects, abundantly available, incredibly nutritious. There's one area that I think is interesting. We know that meat is taking an interesting turn in how that's going, whether you love or hate that. Meat can, at some point soon, will be created in a laboratory away from rangelands, and that's another source of where meat can come from. And I haven't even talked about meat that's not real meat, like the Beyond Company and those sorts, which are having unprecedented growth and popularity. I was looking into algae. I didn't realise how important, I don't know if you'd heard much about algae, Slade, but algae being an amazing source of food, being the fastest growing plant on the planet. And it's an amazing opportunity to get involved in algae farming. And it hadn't really occurred to me, but that's relevant for freshwater or saltwater, which is where most of that would accumulates. But it hadn't really come about in my thinking. So I think that there's a lot of research and learning to be done there. And do you know the other one that fascinates me, Slade, and I'm not sure it fascinates me because I want to eat it yet, but because the technology just makes me curious, but is this 3D printed food. Dial up on your device, I want a hamburger, and it just spits one out for you. Have you got an attitude or a feeling about that one?
I'm sitting here with a background that's actually a representation of the flight deck of the Enterprise. And in that series, for those who know it really well, they walk up to a replicator and they actually produce the food item that they feel like for their meal. I think that technology actually is pointing to something in the future that's going to be really amazing and really fun to watch develop. And I think there's going to be a linkage between the source of things like algae as the base level location for getting those various nutrients and proteins from and so on, and actually being able to shape those into a food that's highly palatable and that actually meets what a consumer wants, and does so in a lower impact mechanism.
And for someone like you and I, Slade, we get excited about the tech side of it, but I'm yet to get excited about the idea of the consuming side of it, because it's a mental thing, isn't it? It's about being able to change what food means to you. And it sounds ridiculous because we want to be able to go away from heavily processed food, and this feels like we're going back to that. Yet if we've got the same nutritional composition and the taste, well, it's going to take a bit of a mind shift for me, I feel, but it's going to be a really interesting place to go in the future with food.
For me, there's a massive mind shift involved. You know, here on EcoThought Farm, we produce a high-grade lamb, and we know the traceability and the story and the history of that product that we're consuming. I'm still not sure about replicated food and proteins coming from algae and so on. I've tasted the insects. If you go to Thailand, you could buy those insects in the marketplace for a very, very long time. In fact, they've been eating insects over there for generations. And you know what? I've had some beautiful meals actually over in Thailand made with some of those insects. So that's one that I can actually wrap my head around because of the work that's been done outside of Australia. I think there's just some great things coming in the future around being able to understand where your food comes from. And I think that people demanding to actually know where their food comes from, what the point of origin is, knowing what the story is with the food from the point that it was produced to the point that it's on your plate is going to be one of the major drivers for this innovation. And I know Casey and Jem, we've gone off onto a whole pile of different aspects of food production, but they're all important parts of that food security story. And I'm hoping that for this, in particular for the students that are listening, that it might actually guide some of your thinking in working out how you might innovate. And I think that if at the base of it, the data can be used to actually inform the consumer, then you will see two things. Number one, a traceability in the food production which people want, but also I think an increased willingness to pay true value for food. Right now in Australia, one of our greatest problems is that people are not paying the true cost for the production of our food. The true cost in terms of water usage, and those battles are being played out in the Murray-Darling Basin, and we're seeing that play out year on year. Consequently, because people don't pay the true cost of the water utilisation, we're not seeing that flow through into the consumer's cost of consumption. All of those things need to be dealt with in understanding that food security chain for the future. So there are things that as students working on this stuff in the future that you might want to be thinking about.
So there's a couple of ways to answer this, and I'll answer it in this way. So leading back to the decline in populations and the crash that happened about 15 years ago, at the time when that big crash in populations of bees happened, lots of research money was allocated to try and work out why. And that research money was then given to many different research groups who conducted small-scale experiments on a whole range of factors that were thought to be a problem for bees. And so unfortunately, because each of those experiments was relatively small, it means that we have a whole list of implicated factors as opposed to proven factors. And we don't even know if it's an individual factor or if it's a combination of factors. And so things such as pesticides, miticides, herbicides, fungicides, the things that those treat, changes in weather events, the way we handle the bees, malnutrition. There's a whole range of factors, you know, and so the way that science is conducted traditionally is manually. They'll take a bee, they sedate the bee by refrigerating it, they shave a little bit of the fur off the back of the bee, and then they put colored swatches onto the bee. So they basically paint a little paint swatch onto them. And then you have some person who gets into a bee suit and sits in front of a hive or goes out into an orchard and with a clipboard and a pen looking for bees with colored swatches on them. And they see the bee, they see what it's doing, they look at the time, they find the appropriate thing, they write it down. And so that's only going to work when you have people available. So generally during daytime hours, in good weather. And it's prone to error because the person has to look away. And so as a result, there's actually quite a large range of companies now that are looking to produce IoT solutions to put onto or in hives to measure a whole range of metrics such as temperature and humidity and the sound of the bees and so forth. What we've done at CSIRO is we've set up a project where we put tags onto bees, and we have a custom entry and a reader for those tags. We also put feeding stations out, and that way we can monitor the activities of the bees coming and going, and we're using that to produce models of bee behavior that will allow us to determine when there's factors impacting the bees. It also allows us to run experiments with those particular factors that have been identified to see if that modifies bee behavior and causes issues in the hive. And that way we can produce an AI-driven system that will look at the behavior data of a given hive and be able to tell you if there's a problem, what the problem likely is, and how long you need to act before there's a problem. So essentially it's a system to try and help the beekeeper or the owner of the apiary to intervene before their colony collapses, so that before there's a death in the hive. So for us, we've partnered globally with a whole bunch of different research organizations so that we have a much larger reach, and using our kit, they're using a standard kit with a standard data format and a standard data exchange. And that way we can compare data from all over the world. But yeah, there are quite a number of smaller companies that are doing innovation in this space as well.
I think it's really great, all three of you sharing about, you know, technology and innovation with the bee itself, technology and innovation within the hive, what is happening on a global scale. But I guess that leads to our next question. And what can the everyday person do right now to contribute positively to this space? We've touched on what's happening from a primary industry perspective, from a global perspective, but what can the everyday person do?
Can I answer this one first, Simon? The number one question that you should know and be able to answer is, where has your food come from and what has been the carbon contribution in order to place that food on your plate? The idea that we can eat cherries in the middle of winter from California or oranges at the opposite time of the year to the time that they're in season in Australia is something that we need to think very, very hard about in the future. I don't think that we can accept those carbon miles until we can find a better mechanism to actually carry that food safely around the world without making such a large contribution to the carbon footprint associated with that food. I think people need to be understanding where their food has come from and what the carbon contribution is. In the region where I live, in the Harcourt Valley, the Castlemaine, Bendigo area, there is a major movement around local food, so that you can actually go into local fruiterers, for example, and you can actually know where that product came from that you're about to select. So you know what the carbon footprint of that food production is. You need to be asking the questions, where is it coming from?
And what goes perfectly with that, Slade, relating to a big part of this conversation, is where does your honey come from that you have in your pantry and the like. And I challenge anyone listening to this that's not a beekeeper, because you've probably got plenty of honey in the cupboard as it is from your own bees, but if you can't source locally produced honey, and when I say locally, I'm going to say within, say, 10 kilometres of where you live, that would really surprise me. For example, in the state of Victoria, I think there's around 10,000 registered beekeepers, probably more than that in reality. But with 10,000 beekeepers, of which many of them are small-scale urbanised beekeepers, they're like me. I've got a property here in Mount Martha. Down the back corner, there's a small section there where there's 3 beehives. And in Mount Martha, I think there's another 30 or 40 people which are registered with beehives. So if you think about that alone, and the fact that I can harvest from 3 beehives well over 100 kilograms a year, and that's conservative, there is someone nearby that has plenty of honey at home, and they are willing to sell that to you. In fact, they get great delight in being able to share that with you, and you can source that locally. And the little added bonus there, if you're someone who has hay fever, suffering from pollens and the like nearby, if you're micro-dosing yourself every single day with some honey that's been sourced locally from plants sourced locally, the pollen in that honey are probably some of the triggers that would normally make you feel a little bit unwell during the pollen time of year. It can slowly inoculate you against that particular issue. But that's just a little side one. The point that I wanted to make about what you can do right now to contribute to bees or in this area, Peter mentioned about plant more flowers. Yes, you should do that. Lots of diversity of flowers across all year. Yes, you can put water out for bees. That's a good idea. Have bees yourself, of course. The one I want you to think about is not just honeybees, but other pollinators that are out there also require habitat. So my honeybees, I provide them with a habitat of where they can live inside a beehive. But other pollinators from native Australian bees and moths and butterflies and even birds all require their own habitat. It's common for us to want to clean up all the weeds and all the debris and all the mess and the muck that might sit around our property. But you probably don't realise the value of what's actually living in there, apart from when you scratch back some leaves on the ground, you might see bugs squirreling everywhere. There might be native pollinators that also rely on that to shelter and to stay away, because most bee species, and especially the native bee species, don't colonise like a European honeybee species does. They live solitary and quietly on their own. And if you're cleaning up, mowing the lawn every 6 days, my wife would laugh at me about that because she'd suggest I do that. But if you're doing that sort of activity, or you're removing all the blackberries, or you're trying to solve all these weed problems in your area, sometimes you're actually removing all of the good habitat for some of those local pollinators that are really important. So I give you permission to leave the weeds in the corner, leave the pile of sticks down the backyard that has been bothering you for a long time. You don't always have to clean up after yourself, because there's still value in that.
So there's actually a range of things that people can do. The one that you see most often is plant flowers or plant flowering plants, right? Because then you're providing a food source, both pollen and nectar, for bees in the local area. If your municipality allows it, have a hive in the backyard. It can be honeybees, it might be native stingless bees, but you can run your own hives. You can put out water for the bees, and during times of drought. It's mostly about generating an environment in which the bees have a ready supply of food and water. Another thing to be aware of is if you're going to be spraying, some form of pesticide or herbicide, Just be aware of when flowering seasons are so that you don't end up inadvertently killing the local bee populations. Another good way to do this is to engage with the beekeeping association in your area and getting advice from the beekeepers about how you can support the bees in your area.
There's some fantastic ways we can get involved in our own backyards and that we may not have thought of before. And I know there's some local students participating in the Bees with Backpacks Design Challenge, which I know you're all been heavily involved in. These students will be thinking on how they can create a bee-friendly environment, and we're lucky to receive some questions from these students. And so the first question from one of the students is, there's AI technology that can identify varroa mites, but what are other technologies that can be used to detect and eliminate mites or other pests that get into the hives? And is there any cheaper ways that could be handed out to beekeepers to help them eliminate the problem?
Peter has certainly already mentioned some of the low-tech options there, and it's important to realise that in beekeeping there are many low-tech, simple, whether it be a mechanical or sort of little engineering fix that allows you to solve a problem from if small hive beetle, which is a nasty pest that you can get, a simple way to manage that is you can put a little trap with some basic oil, like just some cooking oil in it, and the beetles actually wander into the trap and drown in the trap, and that solves that problem before it becomes a real disaster. For the same pest, you can also put like your blue dishcloths inside the top of the hive, and their legs get tangled, and you can catch them and trap them there. So we've got to not forget that despite technology advancements and innovation, there are some real low-tech, simplistic ways. And Pete's sugar shake that he was talking about before, using the icing sugar, is an important one. But where we're going with technology, and we talked a bit about that earlier, is quite phenomenal. And in short, I don't know. And Slade made the point before of we need to start seeing the data and start to learn from the data what it can tell us. But we shouldn't delay. We need to be starting to sense and analyse and try to do that interpretation now so that we can learn what it is that we might be able to do. And artificial intelligence can inform us what we can't easily understand ourselves. It can start to tell us and pick patterns and see trends that we wouldn't observe naturally and easily ourselves. So I'm excited about artificial intelligence in this space. The reality is that whilst here in Australia we have a strong commercial beekeeping industry, it's also an ageing industry, and there is a huge push in the last 10 years really, to get more younger people into commercial beekeeping to be the next generation of beekeepers. The challenge for those people is getting 30 or 40 or sometimes even 50 years of experience, gathering that together quickly so you can be as competent, as capable and as efficient as those beekeepers that have been in it for such a long time. Nothing replaces like 50 years of experience. Nothing can replace that. But we need to find ways that can support the enthusiastic, excited 32-year-old commercial beekeeper to do an efficient and thorough job and keep them in business, especially with all the pressures that face beekeeping in Australia and globally at the moment. And if we can provide tools and innovation to make that easier and smarter and more efficient, more productive, I like the future of this industry even more than I already do, because we can fuse technology with traditional methods to make really smart and effective beekeepers, the next generation of beekeepers in this space.
I just as a follow on to what you just said, Simon, just a couple of things. It's always been a key message of mine throughout my 30 years in this technology industry to actually say that technology actually encompasses everything that we have developed as Homo sapiens sapien from our earliest days as hunter-gatherers. And frequently, particularly in the last 20 to 30 years in my industry, I've seen guys racing always to the high-tech solution for problems, when in many cases, the solution is the lowest tech problem. I give you an example. I was supporting some work in the Solomons for a deployment over there where they had civil unrest. And we were having real problems keeping technology up so that they could communicate all the time. The laptops were not responding well to the high humidity and so on. In the end, the solution we came up with was that the most effective mechanism for communicating there and sending a message to the rear was a soggy piece of paper and a very soft pencil. That was something that was down on the low-tech spectrum, but it answered the problem of effective communication. So whilst we might use AI to identify some of the things that need to be addressed, sometimes the solutions to the problems that are identified may actually be quite low tech, as both Simon and Peter have said. The other point I would make is that the aging problem that we see in this industry is a problem that exists across all agricultural industries. The aging of the food production people is a major concern for that food security. We need to do two things with respect to the machine learning. Critical to machine learning is actually the insertion of human knowledge. And we need to do things that allow the farmers, the beekeepers, and so on to actually see the data and to go, oh, what you're seeing is this, and this is how we address it. And that information needs to be captured in conjunction with that machine learning, because that way the AI gets taught from the machine learning systems what that human experience has actually drawn out over 30 or 40 years of working in the industry. So we need to come up with those mechanisms that allows that coupling between human knowledge and what the system is seeing as we gather huge volumes of data.
I really love that you're touching on both low tech and high tech options. I think sometimes we can agree with you there that high tech seems like the fast and easy option, but sometimes it's the low tech that is the most effective.
So, okay, I'll answer this question in two parts. The varroa destructomite, the method that's kind of standardized and used at the moment is a thing called a sugar shaker. And so essentially you put the bees into a little jar and give them a shake with icing sugar. And then you tip that out. And when the bees come out, the bees that have those mites on them, the varroa destructomite, the icing sugar sticks to the mite and it becomes visible. So you basically got a visible inspection method. So that's the accepted approach to identifying varroa destructor at the moment. There are a number of research organizations that are looking at other ways to identify pests coming in and out of hives or within hives, other than just visual inspection, which is how it's normally done. You actually go to the hive and have a look. And there's people looking at biomarkers, because a lot of insects release chemicals from their body, and if you can detect those chemicals, you can detect the pest or the disease within the hive. Other people are looking at using cameras to identify things coming and going from the hive, and there's also some people that are listening to the bees in the hive, so they're doing audio recordings to detect changes in behavior that may indicate that there's a threat to the hive, be that a disease or a parasite or a pest or some other kind of predator. So there's lots of different techniques that people are using, but the current standard thing is to use visible inspection. And so, yeah, cameras and biodetectors and audio detectors. So there's a whole range of ways of doing that.
We have another question from another student, which is, Will the creation of robotic nano insects solve the problem of declining population of bees and other pollinating insects?
This is actually really simple for me to answer. Keeping an open mind, of course, because I also live in a mind of like anything's possible. But in short, no, it's not about a replacement of the bees, because the bees do $4 to $6 billion worth of pollination work here in Australia every single year. So think about the economics of replacing something robotic that is already working in nature and working quite well here. But there are huge opportunities for, and this is being done, as Pete had already mentioned, this is already being worked on. There are huge opportunities for nano robots and the like to support and assist in this pollination and honeybee space. And that could be anything from precision application of pesticides or herbicides into an environment so that they act only on the species that they need to be acted. So there's absolutely zero drift or zero impact on bee species. I can easily imagine that. That's actually probably not far away. To drone technology, micro drone technology that goes out there and chases down invertebrate pests like moths or hornets, identifies them with their vision, with their computer vision, goes towards them and destroys them whilst they're in midair in order to protect the impact of that particular pest from the honeybee. All those things are realistic now, and we'll see more of that coming out in the future. That is absolutely certain. But do I think that like micro nano robots are going to replace bees in the short term? I don't think so. Not yet.
I guess one thing to say about this is that, yes, nanobots offer a lot of promise for the future, but there is one skill that bees have that I think we are even further from achieving with nanobots, and that is that the bees replicate themselves. Nanobots won't, in the near future, be able to self-replicate and produce more nanobots from themselves. Bees just continue to produce and to continue to supply and resupply their population in a way that responds to the demands of the environment and also to the constraints of the environment, because bees automatically adjust their population based on the availability of the resources in that landscape. I think it'll be a long time before nanobots get to that stage. And I tell you that as a technologist.
I love the fact, Slade, that this question was asked, because there's a student there with a huge, broad mind going, can we do this? So I don't want to have the risk of the answer that we've given is, the answer is no, is like the short version, but keep thinking like that. Keep thinking about all the options and all the ideas and have as much innovation as you possibly can, because chances are that one of those crazy ideas that seems out of reach right now will be something that we're all doing in 10 years from now or 20 years from now. So keep, whoever that was, and for the rest of the students here, keep thinking that way. Good job.
Again, I point out this representation of the deck of the Enterprise that I'm supposedly sitting on talking to you. There are an awful lot of things that back in the 60s, and here I go, aging myself, back in the 60s that I watched in the late 60s on Star Trek, and the things that I saw there that now are a reality. One of the funny technologies back there that we thought would never appear was a door that opened automatically as you walked up to it. And they were all over this series in its earliest incarnation. So yes, keep thinking about those technologies, because so often the things that we think were science fiction have become reality. And one of the things that I note as a technologist is the pace at which that has happened, particularly over the last 25 years. That an awful lot of ideas that we thought were out there are now becoming reality. We're now talking about creating human habitation permanently on the moon and on Mars, and we're well on the way to the journey of doing that. And I might add that all of these things that we're talking about with food security and food technologies all have to feed into those programs that sees the human species expand from being single planet to being multi-planet. So keep innovating.
So that's another good question. There are already research organizations around the world. For example, I think it's Harvard, and there's some work in China, and there's a few other institutes as well. But they're looking at producing robotic bees, right? So they've already built sort of robotic bees, or tried to build robotic bees. So it sounds like something out of science fiction, but they're actually working towards the idea of having an artificial replacement for bees to fly around and pollinate bees. I can't tell you whether that's been successful or not, or how successful that is, but there's certainly moves in that direction for using technology to either augment or replace insect pollinators.
Yeah, there's some fantastic questions coming from the students, and I suppose a little segue onto pests, from what you were mentioning in that question, Simon, on how maybe nano insects could assist in this space. But the next question is, how can technology help reduce the risk of bees getting pests in their hives?
We've already got a lot of basic engineering, mechanical type technologies which solve pest-related issues. I do get really excited about some work that we've been involved with, and I know others are involved with, which is like being able to hunt down particular pests and diseases using that computer vision again, and being able to solve those issues, early detection. We've got huge biosecurity risks here in Australia, given that we've been so isolated for so long, but now given the connection that we have globally, albeit a little bit different this year, but it's not unlikely that pests and diseases that exist elsewhere on the planet end up being here in Australia as time goes on. And one of the key ones there that we're really anxious about is the varroa mite. For the beekeepers that are listening in, I'm not going to go to the depth you probably want me to go to there, but the varroa mite is just a small pest that exists on bees and can really decimate colonies and causes huge disruption to the entire industry. We're the last place on the planet to experience varroa mite, bar a few small little incursions. So we need to do everything we can. I think technology's got an answer there, and artificial intelligence, image recognition is something that we're particularly interested in. I've already been doing some work to try to solve that particular problem. Watch this space, there'll be lots more of that too.
I think that I come back to my earlier comment about data. I think that one of the critical things we need to be doing right now is gathering data, both in the form of point information like temperature and humidity and audio signals in the hive, but also in terms of that video and imagery capture and being able to process that information and identify what is happening in a hive using the tools that are now advancing exceptionally quickly. So I think that we have the opportunity to identify pests very early and deal with them before they ever become established as populations. And yes, we talk about varroa mite as one of them, but I think there's a huge opportunity to gather data from multiple point sources. And that includes collaboration from all of the recreational beekeepers that are in an urban area. For example, around the Melbourne Port area, there are a huge amount of recreational beekeepers. And if we could somehow find a way to combine all that data, we can actually probably use it to help identify pests before they become established in the Australian landscape. So I think there's some of the things that we might be able to do in the future to actually address pest problems.
If I lift it up a notch, so above just bees and pests for bees, Slade, you've pointed out really clearly, if we've got a meshed mosaic of data points from beehives, that's very interesting. If we have then smart hives at those locations, which are sensing all sorts of different metrics, then we can compile that data together. People get really scared about the idea of giving forth their data, and I think that something people should absolutely be aware of. But just think about a few possible use cases. If we had internal sensing and external sensing around beehives, not only just of the temperature, humidity, understanding microclimates, that'd be good to learn a bit more about from that. But we could then watch and observe how not just bee pests and diseases move across the landscape, but from pesticides to how pollution may track across the landscape. The distribution of beehives across the land would surprise most people. There's little data points meshed right across Australia. And we wonder, we haven't got the final answer here yet, Slade, as you know, but we wonder whether or not if we had our sensor-enabled beehives distributed right down the eastern seaboard this last summer, what would that information tell us about the progression and danger related to the the devastating fire season that we just had? There is so much that we could learn and take from that data. Unfortunately, one point of the data there, Slade, might be, now no longer have a bee colony there and now no longer have any sensors there, but that alone is a data point of interest. All of it relates back to the data and what stories it can start telling us.
I guess just one last point I would like to make about this is for the students who are thinking about some of these problems, there is not just the problem of the data point and collecting the information, there's the problem of transporting the information. And don't ever get caught into the assumption that everywhere there is mobile phone coverage. There has been a major focus on by a lot of innovators in building technologies around using mobile phone networks as the transmit mechanism. But most of Australia's agricultural area, including many of the areas in which beekeepers deploy their hives, have no communications mechanisms available. Hivekeepers has done a lot of work to actually test options in that landscape. And perhaps that's a conversation that we might have on another occasion about how you might solve some of those problems. But you need to be able to address all three layers. And those three layers that I always talk about is the remote sensing, the transport of the data, and then the processing of the data in the back-end environment. So think about your problem in terms of those aspects.
How can this technology or technology in general?
I suppose technology in general, yeah.
I think, by having technology, initially you would have technology that's monitoring, right? And monitoring the environment and monitoring what's coming and going from the hive, you can have early detection and identification of threats to your hive. And I think that that's probably the next big stage in technology for bees, is being able to identify threats early and deal with them before they are unmanageable. So you're going to be able to identify when wasps and hornets and mites and beetles and all sorts of other things are getting into the hive. Also you'll be able to use your technology to identify changes in hive behavior. So you'll be able to identify non-visible things, so things like pesticide overspray or pollution or other factors that are environmental. You'll be able to see the changes in the behavior in the bees and identify that there's a problem.
There is definitely so much that we can learn from all three of you, and what we can do and what we can do on a global scale as well. I have one final question for all three of you. And in your careers and journeys, and they're all very different from each other, what has surprised you the most about bees, and what have you found the most fascinating thing about bees?
What has surprised me the most, and will have to relate to almost any other beekeeper, is how much you can actually learn and how little idea you actually have about bees. The deeper you get into it, the more you realize you genuinely don't know a whole lot. It really exposes what you don't know. And that might sound a little bit strange, but the thing is, you're dealing with livestock, basically livestock, other living organism, and there's so much to learn from that. One of the ones that interests me the most, that I wasn't really aware of, I might even give you two. Bees are incredibly intelligent. They work effectively together. But when you want to move your beehives from one location to another, despite their intelligence, there's a few strange things which indicates that maybe they've got a few quirks, a bit like us, I suppose. And what I mean by that is you can move bees from Melbourne to Mildura to go up to the almond pollination season. No worries, your bees will be fine with that. But if you want to move the bees across your backyard 10 metres, oh, no, 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 no. They won't let you get away with that easily. You'll move them across there and they'll fly back to the old location. All the foraging bees will keep flying back to the old location thinking that that's where they're meant to be. They will not work that out. So it's quite strange, really. Just like if you wanted to move your bees a kilometre away to your friend's place. No, no, no. They're going to fly back to where they were. And bees usually only fly, well, not usually. Usually they stay fairly close to their hive, but they can fly up to 5 kilometres away from your hive. And that means that you've got to really move them more than 5 kilometres away in order to not experience that problem that I'm talking about. So some of you are probably already thinking, well, if I wanted to move them across my bee yard, my backyard, I need to move them 5 kilometres away, then move them back. Correct. But you also need to leave about a 6-week gap in there, or sometimes longer, so that there's actually a changeover of the bees so that they, when you bring them back, they don't fly back to the old location in your same backyard. This might sound complicated. The strangest experience I had with this, though, was I moved my bees 7 kilometres to a friend's house. And then I came back about a week later, I went up to where the bees were previously, and there was a heap of bees stuck on the back of the shed where the beehive used to be. So they flew 7 kilometres. I didn't even know they could fly that far. They flew 7 kilometres back to their original location. And unfortunately, because I didn't go up there and expect to see this, a week had passed and they had died. And there's about 100 bees or so. So that's one of those really random things. And there's just so much to learn with bees. Can I give one more value add? You're not going to mind, Casey? The other thing, and this is more for those that don't know a lot about bees, but I certainly didn't know this at the start. If you need a new queen bee for your beehive, they send them out in the mail. You ring up a queen breeder. Yep, there's people that breed queens. At certain times of the year only it's effective. They'll send out a queen bee in this little tic-tac box, sort of a little cage. There's a little seal on it. They'll put a few worker bees in there with her. There'll be a bit of a plug here of sugary food for them, for sugary candy that they can eat. And they eat their way out when you put this inside the beehive where you need her to go. Bonus tip, it's about $30 to $40 per queen bee if you want them delivered. Yeah, that's just some of the fascination that sits around bees, and I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
For me, the thing that has stunned me in working with bees is that there is a collective intelligence in there. And I think that there's something we can learn from as humans, because their level of cooperation with each other is astounding. Peter's talked about, I think he called it the wiggle, didn't you, Peter? So
yeah, he's talking about the waggle dance.
Yeah, the waggle dance, that's it. And I'm stunned at how they seem to share information. What one bee knows in a colony, all of the bees know in a colony. And I find that a fascinating thing. And if you ask Casey that single thing that has most astounded me in working with bees, it's that one, that they have this ability to collaborate, to share information, and what one knows, everybody knows.
Oh, this could be an entire story. I think that I hadn't worked with bees like this before. I've done work in marine sensing and energy prediction and the health space and a few other places. So once I came into looking at bees, this was quite a good learning curve. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that you've got different groups of people who are working with bees who can share different kinds of knowledge. So you'll get, of course, researchers, you get entomologists who have a very academic view of how things work. And so it's really good for learning a whole bunch of facts and things that have been shown in the literature. But some of the most interesting things you pick up by just listening to the beekeepers who've been doing beekeeping over an extended period. So that's really, really interesting. I think one of the coolest things you learn about bees when you're first starting to get into bees is about the Waggle Dance. And the Waggle Dance was actually discovered a very long time ago and resulted in the discoverer winning the Nobel Prize. And so effectively, the way bees communicate is they come back to the hive from foraging and they do a dance where they do a little figure of eight. So I'll do it this way so you can see they do a little figure of eight at the entrance to the hive, and the other bees watch. And it's called a waggle dance because they're waggling while they do it. And so essentially the bees, because they're seeing an ultraviolet, they're navigating off the ultraviolet light coming from the sun. So the sun is their yardstick, it's their metric, it's what they're using as their ground truth. And so the direction that the axis of the waggle relative to the sun is telling the other bees the direction, the angle from the hive that the food or water or nectar source is. How vigorously they shake is telling you how good the source is, and how long they dance for is telling you how far it is. And that sounds pretty cool until you also realize that the bee has adjusted all those figures to account for the change in position of the sun from when they were at that source. So they've taken into account the time it's taken them to fly back from position of the sun. They've also taken into account the wind, so whether they were flying with the wind or against the wind. And so they're correcting all of their things in this dance to give an accurate position. And then when the other bees fly out, if they fly later, they correct for the change in the sun from when they saw the dance. So they also correct for wind and sun changing position so that they can find the food source. What's interesting is that then they go out and have a look at it and come back. And of course, the first bee will continue to do that dance. And if the other bees agree, they leave the bee alone. And if they disagree, they actually bump the bee. So it's almost like a voting system. If enough bees agree, that's good. It's decided that that's a good source. And if they disagree, enough bees disagree, they go, no, we've had a look, it's not that good. And so they don't go there. And so for me, that was probably one of the really interesting things learning about bees, is that for such a small insect, they have this really clever way of communicating, and they can adjust for all of those different variables. It's really quite intriguing.
Amazing what bees are capable of doing, and I think there's so much to learn in that space. So thanks for that, Peter. This has been an unbelievable tech talk to be part of and listen to, and I'm sure our viewers will agree. So on behalf of the Bendigo Tech School, we'd like to thank you all for sharing your time, your insights, and the amazing innovations and work that's been done to really save the bee population from extinction. And of course, we're looking forward to our continuing partnership on the Bees with Backpacks program. So thank you all again.
This has been fascinating and a real pleasure to be a part of. So thanks very much for having us along.
Thanks so much for listening.